Staff Sergeant Lily Morrison had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, defused countless IEDs, and earned the respect of every soldier in her unit. But nothing prepared her for what would happen during a routine inspection at Fort Davidson when Colonel Bradley Hutchinson decided to make an example out of her in front of the entire battalion. What started as intimidation tactics would end with the sound of breaking bones echoing across the parade ground, witnessed by over 200 shocked service members.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Davidson's main parade ground as Staff Sergeant Lily Morrison adjusted her uniform one final time. The quarterly inspection was set to begin in 20 minutes, and she could already see the rigid formation of Alpha Battalion assembling in perfect lines across the asphalt. At 28, Lily had learned that military inspections were theater as much as they were evaluation, a carefully choreographed display of discipline and order. She ran her fingers along the pressed edges of her dress blues, checking each ribbon and medal for the third time that morning. The bronze star with valor gleamed under the harsh sunlight, a reminder of that night in Kandahar when she'd pulled 2 wounded Marines from a burning vehicle while under enemy fire. Next to it sat her combat engineer badge, the explosive ordnance disposal badge, and a row of service ribbons that told the story of 6 years in the Army that had taken her from a scared 19-year-old from Detroit to one of the most respected non-commissioned officers on base. The other soldiers were gathering now, their conversations creating a low murmur that drifted across the formation area. Lily recognized most of the faces: Sergeant First Class Marcus Rodriguez from Weapons Company, Lieutenant Sarah Chen from Bravo Company, Corporal James Washington, who'd arrived just last month from basic training. They were good soldiers, the kind who followed orders without question and had each other's backs when things got rough. What they didn't know was that today's inspection carried unusual weight. Word had been circulating through the NCO ranks for weeks that Colonel Bradley Hutchinson was looking to make changes. The new battalion commander had arrived at Fort Davidson 3 months ago with a reputation that preceded him. A hardliner who believed that discipline had grown too lax in the modern military, particularly when it came to female soldiers in combat roles. Lily had first encountered Colonel Hutchinson during her second week back from deployment. She'd been walking past the motor pool when she heard him discussing personnel files with Major Patricia Kellerman, the battalion executive officer. His voice carried further than he probably intended, and his words had made her stomach tighten with familiar dread. "These women think they can waltz into combat units and demand special treatment," Hutchinson had said, his Texas drawl thick with disdain. "Back in my day, we knew how to maintain proper military bearing. Now, we've got female soldiers thinking they're entitled to the same respect as men who've actually earned it." Major Kellerman had tried to redirect the conversation, mentioning the unit's impressive deployment statistics and commendations, but Hutchinson had cut her off. "Statistics don't mean much when discipline breaks down. I've seen what happens when standards get lowered to accommodate diversity quotas. It's time to remind everyone what real military service looks like." The conversation ended there, but Lily had walked away with a cold understanding of what lay ahead. She'd served under commanders like Hutchinson before, men who saw her presence in their units as a political statement rather than recognizing her as a professional soldier who'd earned her place through competence and sacrifice. Now, as she watched the colonel emerge from the battalion headquarters building, Lily could see that familiar, calculating look in his eyes. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who'd never doubted his authority, his silver eagles catching the sunlight as he surveyed the assembled troops. At 52, Hutchinson was still an imposing figure, 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the kind of commanding presence that had probably served him well throughout his 28-year career. Behind him walked Command Sergeant Major Thomas Fletcher, a weathered veteran whose expression remained carefully neutral. Fletcher had served with Lily during her first deployment and knew her capabilities firsthand. The tension between him and the new colonel had been obvious from day one, though Fletcher was too professional to let it show publicly. The inspection began routinely enough. Hutchinson moved through the front ranks with methodical precision, checking uniforms, questioning soldiers about military regulations, and occasionally offering terse nods of approval. Lily stood in the third row, maintaining the rigid posture that had become second nature after years of military service. As the colonel worked his way closer to her section, she noticed his pace slowing slightly. When he reached Sergeant Rodriguez, who stood 2 positions to her left, Hutchinson spent several minutes examining the soldier's uniform and asking detailed questions about weapons maintenance procedures. Rodriguez answered each question correctly, his responses crisp and confident. Then, Hutchinson moved to Private First Class Amy Stevens, a young soldier who joined the unit straight from advanced individual training. Stevens had been nervous all morning, and it showed in the slight tremor in her voice when she recited the soldier's creed. But her uniform was immaculate, and her knowledge of regulations was solid. After a few minutes, Hutchinson moved on. When he finally stepped in front of Lily, the entire dynamic shifted. Instead of the professional demeanor he'd maintained with the other soldiers, his expression hardened into something that looked almost predatory. He stood close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that his proximity felt deliberately invasive.
"Staff Sergeant Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across the silent formation. "I've been looking forward to this conversation." The words themselves seemed innocuous, but the tone carried unmistakable menace. Lily kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, maintaining perfect military bearing, even as every instinct screamed that this encounter would be different from the routine inspections she'd endured hundreds of times before. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady and professional. Hutchinson began his examination, but unlike with the previous soldiers, he took his time with every detail. He spent nearly 5 minutes scrutinizing her ribbons and medals, questioning the circumstances behind each commendation with an aggressive tone that suggested he doubted their legitimacy. When he reached her combat engineer badge, he actually laughed, a sound that carried no humor whatsoever. "Interesting collection of decorations for someone who's supposed to be setting an example," he said, loud enough for the nearby soldiers to hear clearly. "Tell me, Morrison, do you think these ribbons make you special?" The question was obviously designed to provoke a response that would give him grounds for disciplinary action. Lily had encountered this tactic before. Commanders who used public humiliation as a tool to assert dominance, particularly over soldiers they viewed as threats to their authority. "No, sir," she answered. "They represent the completion of assigned duties and adherence to Army values." Her response was textbook perfect, but Hutchinson's expression suggested that her professionalism only irritated him further. He stepped even closer, violating the normal boundaries of military courtesy in a way that made several nearby soldiers shift uncomfortably. "Army values," he repeated mockingly. "And which value do you think is most important, Staff Sergeant?" The question was clearly a setup, but Lily had no choice but to engage. "Honor, sir, the foundation of all military service." "Honor." Hutchinson drew the word out, making it sound like an accusation. "That's interesting, because I've been reviewing your file, Morrison, and I'm starting to wonder if you really understand what honor means in this man's army." The weight of those words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Lily felt the collective intake of breath from the soldiers around her, the subtle shift in posture that indicated everyone within earshot understood they were witnessing something far beyond a routine inspection. Colonel Hutchinson's accusation about her understanding of honor was deliberately ambiguous, designed to plant seeds of doubt about her character without making specific allegations that could be challenged through proper channels. "Sir, I believe my service record speaks to my commitment to Army values," Lily responded, maintaining the calm professionalism that had served her well through countless difficult situations. She knew that any display of emotion would give Hutchinson exactly what he wanted, grounds to claim she was unstable or unsuitable for her position. Hutchinson circled around her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. The movement forced Lily to remain at rigid attention while he disappeared from her peripheral vision, a psychological tactic meant to increase stress and uncertainty. She could hear his boots scraping against the asphalt, could sense the hostile energy radiating from his presence even when she couldn't see him.
"Your service record," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Let's talk about that, shall we? 3 deployments to Afghanistan, multiple commendations for courage under fire, glowing efficiency reports from your previous commanders, very impressive on paper." He paused directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath on the back of her neck. Several soldiers in the formation were beginning to look uncomfortable, their faces showing confusion and concern at the colonel's unprofessional behavior. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher took a half-step forward, his jaw clenched with obvious disapproval, but protocol prevented him from intervening without direct cause. "But I've learned not to trust paperwork when it comes to certain types of soldiers," Hutchinson continued, moving back into her line of sight. "Sometimes commendations get handed out for political reasons. Sometimes commanders write favorable reports because they're afraid of discrimination complaints. Sometimes the truth gets buried under layers of bureaucratic correctness." The implications of his words were crystal clear to everyone present. He was essentially accusing her superior officers of dishonesty, suggesting that her accomplishments were unearned and that her presence in the unit was the result of social engineering rather than merit. It was a deeply personal attack disguised as professional criticism. Lily felt anger building in her chest, but she channeled it into focus. She'd faced enemy fire in Helmand Province, had walked through minefields where one wrong step meant death, had carried wounded comrades to safety while bullets snapped past her head. A bitter colonel with outdated attitudes wasn't going to break her composure. "My decorations were earned through actions witnessed by multiple soldiers and verified through proper military channels," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the provocation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Hutchinson's expression darkened at her refusal to be intimidated. He'd clearly expected her to either become flustered or to respond with anger that he could then use to justify disciplinary action. Instead, her professional demeanor was making his own behavior look increasingly inappropriate. "Witnessed by soldiers who might have their own reasons for supporting false narratives," he shot back. "I've seen how these situations work, Morrison. A female soldier gets into trouble, claims harassment or discrimination, and suddenly everyone's afraid to tell the truth about her performance." The accusation was so far beyond the bounds of professional conduct that several NCOs in the formation exchanged shocked glances. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez actually took a small step forward, his face flushed with indignation at hearing his integrity questioned. Lieutenant Chen's hands had curled into fists at her sides, though she maintained her position in the formation. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher finally spoke up, his voice carefully controlled but carrying unmistakable authority. "Sir, perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. The troops are waiting for the completion of their inspection." Hutchinson whirled on Fletcher with surprising viciousness. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sergeant Major? Because if you have concerns about how I conduct military operations, I'd be happy to discuss them with the post commander." The threat was explicit: fall in line or face potential career consequences. Fletcher's jaw worked silently for a moment, decades of military discipline warring with his obvious desire to protect a soldier under his command. Finally, he stepped back into position, though his eyes never left Hutchinson's face. Emboldened by Fletcher's forced compliance, Hutchinson turned his attention back to Lily with renewed aggression. "You know what I think, Morrison. I think you've been coasting on other people's sympathy for far too long. I think you've gotten used to special treatment, used to having male soldiers cover for your inadequacies because they're afraid of being labeled sexist." He moved closer again, this time positioning himself at an angle that blocked her from the view of most of the formation. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper that only she and the soldiers in the immediate vicinity could hear. "But I'm not afraid of your games. I've been dealing with soldiers like you for 3 decades, and I know how to restore proper discipline to a unit that's been corrupted by political correctness.
By the time I'm finished, you'll either learn your place or find yourself transferred to some desk job where you can't do any more damage to unit cohesion." The personal nature of the attack finally pushed Lily past the boundaries of standard military courtesy. She turned her head slightly to meet his gaze directly, a movement that technically violated parade rest posture but was necessary to address his accusations properly. "Sir, with respect, my place is wherever the Army needs qualified soldiers. I've served with distinction in combat roles because I've earned that right through training, dedication, and proven performance under fire. If you have specific concerns about my conduct or capabilities, I respectfully request that they be addressed through proper military channels." Her words were carefully chosen, technically respectful, but carrying an underlying steel that made it clear she wasn't going to be easily intimidated. The directness of her response seemed to caught Hutchinson off guard. He'd obviously expected her to either submit meekly or respond with emotion that would justify further harassment. Instead, her professional pushback had created a public moment where his continued aggression would make him look petty and unprofessional in front of the entire battalion. For a few seconds, uncertainty flickered across his features as he realized that his intimidation tactics weren't having the desired effect. But rather than backing down, Hutchinson's frustration seemed to fuel his determination to assert dominance. His face reddened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire formation with unmistakable malice. "You want to talk about proper channels, Staff Sergeant? Then let's discuss the proper chain of command. When I give you an order, you follow it without question. When I tell you that your attitude is unacceptable, you acknowledge that criticism and work to correct your deficiencies. And when I determine that changes need to be made to restore discipline to this unit, you accept those changes without argument." He stepped even closer, now clearly invading her personal space in a way that would be considered assault in civilian contexts. The violation was so obvious that murmurs began rippling through the formation as soldiers recognized that they were witnessing something far beyond acceptable military conduct. The morning air seemed to thicken as Colonel Hutchinson positioned himself mere inches from Lily's face, his proximity crossing every line of military professionalism. She could see the veins bulging in his neck, could smell the stale cigarette smoke clinging to his uniform, could feel the heat radiating from his flushed skin. Behind him, the entire Alpha Battalion had gone silent, 200 pairs of eyes witnessing behavior that violated every principle of leadership they'd been taught to respect. "Starting tomorrow," Hutchinson announced, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the formation, "Staff Sergeant Morrison will be reassigned to administrative duties pending a full review of her fitness for combat roles. I'm also recommending that her security clearance be suspended while we investigate discrepancies in her deployment reports."
The allegations were serious enough to end her career, and everyone present understood the implications. A suspended security clearance would prevent her from performing most meaningful military duties, while an investigation into her deployment conduct would create a permanent cloud over her service record. Even if the charges were eventually dismissed, the damage to her reputation would be irreversible. But more than the professional threat, it was the calculated cruelty of the public humiliation that finally pushed Lily past her breaking point. She'd endured months of subtle harassment, had maintained her professionalism through increasingly hostile encounters, had followed proper channels to address concerns that were systematically ignored. Now Hutchinson was attempting to destroy her career based on fabricated allegations, using his rank as a weapon against a soldier who had committed no offense other than excelling in a role he believed should be reserved for men. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with razor-sharp precision, "those allegations are false, and you know it. My deployment records are spotless, my security clearance has never been questioned, and every action I've taken in combat has been verified and commended by my chain of command." The directness of her challenge sent a visible shock through the formation.
Military protocol demanded that she accept his pronouncements without argument, regardless of their validity. By openly contradicting a superior officer in front of the entire battalion, she was technically guilty of insubordination, a charge that could result in court-martial proceedings. Hutchinson's face went from red to purple as he realized she'd just handed him the justification he needed for more severe disciplinary action. A malicious smile spread across his features as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be the killing blow to her military career. "That's it, Morrison. You've just proven everything I've been saying about your lack of discipline and respect for authority. Consider yourself under arrest for insubordination and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer." He reached for her shoulder, intending to physically demonstrate his authority by placing her in custody in front of the assembled troops. It was a gesture designed to complete her humiliation, to show every soldier present what happened to those who dared challenge his absolute power. But as his hand moved toward her, muscle memory from years of combat training kicked in with lightning speed. Lily had spent countless hours learning to defend herself against attackers, had been trained to respond instantly to threats, had developed reflexes honed by life-or-death situations where hesitation meant casualties. When Hutchinson's fingers made contact with her shoulder in what she instinctively recognized as an aggressive grab, her body reacted before her conscious mind could process the full situation. Her left hand swept up to capture his wrist while simultaneously pivoting her body to break his grip. The movement was fluid and precise, a textbook defensive technique that she'd practiced thousands of times in training facilities from Fort Benning to Kandahar. But what happened next was purely instinctive. As Hutchinson tried to maintain his grab and assert physical dominance, Lily's right hand came across in a sharp, controlled strike that caught his extended wrist at exactly the right angle. The sound that followed was unmistakable, the distinct crack of bone breaking under pressure. It echoed across the silent parade ground like a gunshot, followed immediately by Hutchinson's scream of pain and shock. For several seconds, the entire formation stood frozen in stunned silence. 200 soldiers had just witnessed their battalion commander's wrist being broken by a staff sergeant during what was supposed to be a routine inspection. The implications were staggering. Regardless of the circumstances that led to the confrontation, the physical reality was that a subordinate had just seriously injured a superior officer in front of the entire unit. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher was the first to react, moving quickly toward the two combatants while simultaneously barking orders to the nearby medics. His face showed a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed satisfaction. While he couldn't approve of what had just happened, it was obvious that he felt Hutchinson had brought the situation on himself through his inappropriate conduct. "Medic, get over here now!" Fletcher's voice cut through the shocked silence as he positioned himself between Lily and the injured colonel. "Someone call the MPs and the base hospital, and nobody moves from their position until I give the all clear." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the deputy battalion commander who had been observing from the side of the formation, rushed forward to assess the situation. As the senior officer present, she now had to take command of a scenario that had no clear precedent in military regulations. Her face showed the strain of trying to process how a routine inspection had escalated into what appeared to be an assault on a superior officer. Hutchinson was still clutching his wrist, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine pain and shock. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as a strangled whimper rather than the commanding tone he'd maintained throughout the confrontation. She attacked me. Did you all see that? She assaulted a superior officer. I want her arrested immediately." But even as he made the accusation, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The events had unfolded so quickly that he wasn't entirely sure what had actually happened. He remembered reaching for her shoulder, remembered trying to assert his authority through physical contact, but the defensive movement that had resulted in his injury had been almost too fast to follow. Lily stood at rigid attention, her face pale but composed. She made no attempt to flee or excuse her actions, instead maintaining the military bearing that had served her throughout her career.
When Lieutenant Colonel Martinez approached her, she rendered a perfect salute, despite the chaos surrounding them. "Ma'am, I was defending myself against what I perceived as an aggressive physical contact initiated by Colonel Hutchinson. My response was instinctive and based on my combat training. I did not intend to cause injury, but I will not apologize for protecting myself against inappropriate conduct." Her words were carefully chosen and delivered with the same professionalism she'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Even in the aftermath of breaking her commanding officer's wrist, she refused to show weakness or surrender the moral high ground she'd maintained despite his attempts to provoke her into an emotional response. The medics arrived and began examining Hutchinson's injury, their professional assessment confirming what everyone had already heard. His wrist was definitely broken, likely requiring surgery to repair properly. As they prepared to transport him to the base hospital, the full weight of the situation began settling over everyone present. In the space of 30 minutes, a routine quarterly inspection had transformed into a career-ending incident that would require investigations, hearings, and decisions that would affect multiple lives and careers. The ripple effects would extend far beyond the immediate participants, potentially reaching all the way to the Pentagon as military leaders grappled with questions about leadership, harassment, and the appropriate use of force in military settings. The military police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the tense atmosphere that had settled over Fort Davidson's parade ground. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres and Sergeant Mike Williams stepped out of their patrol vehicle, both seasoned MPs who had dealt with everything from bar fights to domestic disputes, but the scene before them was unlike anything in their experience. A broken battalion commander being loaded into an ambulance while his subordinate stood at attention surrounded by 200 witnesses. It was the kind of situation that would require delicate handling and thorough documentation. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez approached the MPs with visible relief, grateful to have someone else take responsibility for the immediate crisis management. As deputy commander, she'd been thrust into a leadership role she'd never trained for, managing the aftermath of an incident that could potentially destroy multiple careers and create headlines that would embarrass the entire Army. "Sergeant Torres," she began, her voice betraying the strain of the past hour, "we have a situation that's going to require a full investigation. Colonel Hutchinson has been transported to the base hospital with what appears to be a broken wrist, allegedly caused by Staff Sergeant Morrison during a confrontation that occurred in front of the entire battalion." Torres nodded professionally, pulling out her incident report pad while Williams began setting up a perimeter to preserve the scene. Both MPs understood that this wasn't a typical assault case. The military justice system had its own complex protocols for dealing with confrontations between service members, particularly when they involved such a significant difference in rank. "Ma'am, we'll need to interview all parties involved and collect statements from witnesses," Torres replied. "Has Staff Sergeant Morrison been advised of her rights under Article 31? The question highlighted one of the many complications surrounding the incident. Article 31 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice provided protections similar to Miranda rights in civilian law, but the circumstances of this case made it unclear whether Lily was a suspect, a victim, or both. Her actions had clearly caused injury to a superior officer, but the context suggested she might have been defending herself against inappropriate conduct. Martinez turned toward Lily, who had maintained her position at rigid attention throughout the chaos. Despite everything that had happened, her military bearing remained impeccable, a fact that wasn't lost on the soldiers who continued to watch from their formation positions. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," Martinez said formally, "you are being questioned in connection with an incident that may result in disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to remain silent, you have the right to consult with an attorney, and you have the right to have an attorney present during any questioning. Do you understand these rights?" "Yes, ma'am," Lily responded without hesitation. "I understand my rights, and I'm prepared to provide a full account of the incident." Her willingness to cooperate surprised some of the observers, but those who knew her well understood that she had nothing to hide. Throughout her military career, she'd faced every challenge with the same direct honesty that had earned her the respect of her peers and superiors. Even in a situation that could end her career, she wasn't going to change her approach. Meanwhile, the battalion remained frozen in formation, unsure whether they should be dismissed or held as potential witnesses. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher made the decision to release them by companies, but ordered all NCOs and officers to remain available for questioning. As the enlisted soldiers began filing away, their conversations were subdued, filled with speculation about what they'd witnessed and what it might mean for the future of their unit. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez approached Lieutenant Chen as they walked toward the barracks, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, I've served with Morrison for 2 years, including our deployment to Kandahar. I've never seen her lose control, not even when we were taking direct fire. Whatever happened out there, it wasn't because she's unstable or violent." Chen nodded thoughtfully. She'd heard the rumors about Colonel Hutchinson's attitudes toward female soldiers, had witnessed his inappropriate comments during staff meetings, but had never seen him cross the line as blatantly as he had during the inspection. The incident forced her to confront her own role in allowing a toxic command climate to develop through her silence.
Rodriguez, I need you to start putting together a list of soldiers who witnessed Colonel Hutchinson's behavior over the past few months. Not just today, but any incidents where he made inappropriate comments or demonstrated bias against female soldiers. If this goes to a formal hearing, Morrison's going to need character witnesses and evidence that this was part of a pattern of harassment. Back at the scene, Sergeant Torres had begun her preliminary interviews with the key witnesses. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher was first, his decades of experience making him an ideal source for context about military protocols and proper conduct. Sergeant Major, in your professional opinion, was Colonel Hutchinson's behavior during the inspection consistent with normal military standards? Torres asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Fletcher's answer was measured but unambiguous. Sergeant, I've been in the Army for 26 years, and I've never seen a superior officer conduct himself the way Colonel Hutchinson did today. His comments were personal attacks rather than professional criticism. His physical positioning was inappropriate, and his decision to make unfounded allegations against a decorated soldier in front of the entire battalion violated every principle of effective leadership. The statement carried significant weight coming from someone of Fletcher's rank and experience. As the senior enlisted advisor to the battalion, his assessment of the situation would be taken seriously by any investigating authority. More importantly, his willingness to speak honestly about a superior officer's misconduct demonstrated the kind of moral courage that the military claimed to value but didn't always reward. Torres continued her questioning, focusing on the specific moments leading up to the physical confrontation. Did you observe Colonel Hutchinson make physical contact with Staff Sergeant Morrison? Yes, I did. He reached for her shoulder in what appeared to be an aggressive grabbing motion. Staff Sergeant Morrison's response appeared to be defensive in nature, consistent with the combatives training all soldiers receive. The colonel's injury was the result of his own decision to initiate inappropriate physical contact. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Fletcher providing detailed observations about the entire incident. His testimony painted a clear picture of escalating harassment culminating in physical aggression by the colonel, followed by an instinctive defensive response from a soldier who had been trained to protect herself from threats. As the formal investigation began taking shape, word of the incident was already spreading throughout Fort Davidson and beyond. The modern military was a small community where news traveled fast, particularly when it involved such a dramatic confrontation between commanders and subordinates. Within hours, officers at the Pentagon would be receiving briefings about the situation, trying to determine how to handle a case that touched on some of the most sensitive issues facing the contemporary military. The implications extended far beyond the immediate participants. Colonel Hutchinson's behavior had been witnessed by an entire battalion, creating a situation where the Army's response would be closely scrutinized by both military personnel and civilian observers. If they failed to take appropriate action against a commander who had clearly abused his authority, it would send a message that harassment and intimidation are acceptable as long as they were carried out by senior officers. But if they came down too hard on Lily for defending herself, it would suggest that soldiers had no recourse when faced with inappropriate conduct from their superiors.
Major Patricia Kellerman arrived at the scene just as the initial interviews were concluding. As the battalion executive officer, she'd been in meetings at brigade headquarters when the incident occurred, but had rushed back as soon as she received word of what had happened. Her face showed a mixture of shock and frustration as she surveyed the aftermath of the morning's events. "Sergeant Major Fletcher," she said, pulling him aside for a private conversation, "I need you to tell me honestly, how bad is this going to get?" Fletcher's response was grimly realistic. "Ma'am, this is going to be a career ender for someone, possibly multiple people. The only question is whether it's going to be Colonel Hutchinson for his conduct or Staff Sergeant Morrison for her response to it. Given the current political climate and the Army's sensitivity about these issues, it could go either way." 3 days after the incident, Lily found herself sitting across from Captain David Nakamura, a military defense attorney who had driven down from Fort Stewart to represent her. In what was rapidly becoming one of the most closely watched military justice cases in recent memory. The small conference room in the base legal office felt cramped and sterile, its fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows across the stack of documents that would determine her future. Captain Nakamura had built his reputation defending soldiers in complex cases where the line between victim and perpetrator wasn't clearly defined. His approach was methodical and thorough, qualities that had served him well in a legal system where careers could be destroyed by procedural errors or overlooked evidence. As he reviewed the preliminary investigation reports, his expression remained carefully neutral, but Lily could sense his growing confidence in her case. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," he began, spreading several witness statements across the table. "I've interviewed 43 soldiers who were present during the inspection, and their accounts are remarkably consistent. Not one person has described your actions as aggressive or unprovoked. In fact, most witnesses specifically mentioned that Colonel Hutchinson's behavior was inappropriate and that your response appeared to be defensive." Lily nodded, though she remained cautious about feeling too optimistic. Military justice could be unpredictable, particularly when it involved such a significant difference in rank between the parties involved. She'd seen good soldiers destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, and she understood that being in the right didn't always guarantee a favorable outcome. "What about Colonel Hutchinson's version of events?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Nakamura's expression darkened slightly. "He's claiming that you attacked him without provocation when he attempted to place you under arrest for insubordination. According to his statement, he was performing his duty as a commanding officer when you suddenly became violent and assaulted him. He's also alleging that you've been insubordinate and disruptive throughout his tenure as battalion commander." The allegations were predictable but still troubling. Hutchinson was clearly attempting to reframe the incident as an unprovoked attack by an unstable subordinate, hoping that his rank and authority would be enough to make his version of events credible. It was a strategy that might have worked in an earlier era, but the presence of so many witnesses made it difficult to sustain. "Captain, there's something else you need to know," Lily said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "This wasn't an isolated incident. Colonel Hutchinson has been systematically targeting female soldiers since he arrived at Fort Davidson. I have documentation of previous encounters, and I know other women who have experienced similar harassment." Nakamura leaned forward with obvious interest. Pattern evidence could be crucial in establishing that the confrontation was part of ongoing misconduct rather than a single misunderstanding that escalated out of control. If they could demonstrate that Hutchinson had a history of inappropriate behavior toward female soldiers, it would significantly strengthen Lily's self-defense claim. "Tell me about these other incidents," he said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. "I need dates, witnesses, and as much specific detail as you can remember." For the next 2 hours, Lily walked him through months of escalating harassment and intimidation. She described the inappropriate comments during staff meetings, the deliberate exclusion from training opportunities, the hostile questioning during routine interactions, and the gradual erosion of professional respect that had culminated in the public confrontation. Each incident by itself might have been dismissed as a personality conflict or misunderstanding, but taken together, they painted a clear picture of systematic bias and abuse of authority. Nakamura took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting additional context. His experience told him that they were building a strong case, but he also knew that military prosecutors would be under significant pressure to pursue serious charges against Lily regardless of the circumstances. The Army couldn't afford to appear lenient toward soldiers who injured their commanding officers, even when those officers had clearly violated their own professional obligations. Meanwhile, across the base at the hospital, Colonel Hutchinson was meeting with his own legal representative, Major Sandra Phillips from the Staff Judge Advocate's office. His wrist was encased in a surgical cast that would require at least 6 weeks to heal properly, a constant reminder of his humiliation in front of the entire battalion. The physical pain was manageable, but the damage to his reputation and authority was proving more difficult to address. "Colonel," Major Phillips said, reviewing her notes from their previous conversations, "I need you to understand that your case is being closely scrutinized at the highest levels. The commanding general has personally reviewed the preliminary reports, and there are concerns about some of the statements attributed to you during the inspection." Hutchinson's face flushed with anger. "Those statements are being taken out of context by people who want to see me fail. I was attempting to restore discipline to a unit that had become too comfortable with lowered standards. Everything I said was in the context of legitimate military leadership." Phillips nodded diplomatically, though privately she had serious doubts about the colonel's version of events. She'd read the witness statements, had spoken with Command Sergeant Major Fletcher, and had reviewed Lily's service record. The evidence suggested that Hutchinson had allowed his personal biases to cloud his professional judgment, creating a situation that reflected poorly on the entire command structure. "Sir, I understand your perspective, but we need to focus on the facts as they'll be presented in any formal proceedings. Multiple witnesses have described your comments as personal attacks rather than professional criticism. The physical positioning that preceded the incident has been characterized as intimidating and inappropriate. And Staff Sergeant Morrison's service record shows no previous disciplinary issues or incidents of violence." The reality was becoming clear to both of them. While Hutchinson might be the victim in terms of physical injury, he was also the architect of the confrontation that had led to that injury. His behavior had been so far outside the bounds of acceptable military conduct that even sympathetic observers were finding it difficult to support his position. Back in the legal office, Captain Nakamura was concluding his initial strategy session with Lily. The case was complex, but he felt confident that they could present a compelling defense based on the documented pattern of harassment and the clear evidence that her actions were defensive rather than aggressive. "Staff Sergeant, here's what we're going to do," he said, organizing his notes into neat stacks. "First, we're going to file a formal complaint against Colonel Hutchinson for sexual harassment and abuse of authority. This will establish that you were the victim of ongoing misconduct, not a soldier who suddenly became violent for no reason. Second, we're going to request a full investigation into the command climate at Fort Davidson under his leadership. And third, we're going to prepare testimony from every witness who can speak to your character and professionalism." The strategy was aggressive but necessary. By going on the offensive, they could shift the focus from Lily's actions to Hutchinson's conduct, forcing the military justice system to confront the underlying issues that had created the confrontational situation. It was a risky approach that could backfire if not handled carefully, but Nakamura believed it was their best chance for a favorable outcome. "What are the possible consequences if we lose?" Lily asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Nakamura's expression grew serious. "If you're convicted of assault on a superior officer, you're looking at a dishonorable discharge, possible imprisonment, and the loss of all veterans' benefits. It would essentially erase everything you've accomplished during your military career. The stakes couldn't be higher. 6 years of dedicated service, 3 combat deployments, multiple commendations for valor. All of it could disappear because she defended herself against an abusive commander. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly a military career could be destroyed by circumstances beyond a soldier's control. But as they prepared to leave the conference room, Lily felt a sense of determination that had sustained her through every challenge she'd faced since joining the army. She'd survived combat operations in Afghanistan, had earned the respect of her peers through competence and courage, and had never backed down from doing what she believed was right. She wasn't going to start now, regardless of the personal cost. 2 weeks after the incident, Brigadier General Patricia Hensley arrived at Fort Davidson to conduct what the Army euphemistically called a climate assessment, but which everyone understood was a comprehensive investigation into the command failures that had led to the most publicized military justice case of the year. General Hensley had built her career on cleaning up troubled units, and her reputation for thorough, impartial investigations made her the obvious choice to handle a situation that had already attracted unwanted media attention. The general's first stop was a closed-door meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, who had been serving as acting battalion commander since Hutchinson's removal from duty pending the investigation. Martinez had spent the previous 2 weeks trying to restore unit cohesion while managing the constant stream of investigators, reporters, and curious officials who seemed to appear daily at Fort Davidson. "Colonel Martinez," General Hensley began, settling into the chair behind what had been Hutchinson's desk. "I've read the preliminary reports, but I want to hear your assessment of the command climate before Colonel Hutchinson's arrival and how it changed under his leadership." Martinez had been dreading this conversation, knowing that her answers could affect the careers of multiple people, including her own. As deputy commander, she bore some responsibility for failing to address Hutchinson's inappropriate behavior before it escalated to violence. The guilt had been eating at her for days, particularly as she'd spoken with female soldiers who had endured months of harassment in silence. "Ma'am, I need to be completely honest with you," Martinez began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "Colonel Hutchinson created a hostile environment for female soldiers from his first week in command. His comments during staff meetings were consistently inappropriate, he openly questioned the capabilities of women in combat roles, and he made it clear that he intended to restore traditional military values to the unit." General Hensley made notes as Martinez continued, her expression growing increasingly grim as the scope of the leadership failure became apparent. The military had spent decades working to integrate women into combat roles and eliminate the kind of institutional bias that Hutchinson represented. To have a battalion commander openly undermining those efforts was a serious threat to military readiness and morale. "Why wasn't this behavior reported through proper channels?" Hensley asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Ma'am, several attempts were made to address the issue. Major Kellerman spoke with Colonel Hutchinson privately about his comments. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher tried to counsel him about maintaining professional standards. I personally raised concerns during our weekly command meetings, but Colonel Hutchinson either dismissed these concerns as political correctness or implied that anyone who disagreed with his approach was part of the problem." The pattern was disturbingly familiar to Hensley, who had seen similar situations throughout her career. Strong-willed commanders could create insular environments where dissent was discouraged and subordinates felt powerless to challenge inappropriate behavior. The military's hierarchical structure, while essential for operational effectiveness, could also enable abuse when checks and balances fail to function properly. Meanwhile, in another part of the base, Captain Nakamura was conducting his own investigation with the help of specialist Jennifer Walsh, a paralegal who had been assigned to assist with the growing mountain of evidence in Lily's case. They had transformed a small office into a war room, with timelines pinned to the walls and witness statements organized in careful stacks across multiple tables. "Captain, I've finished compiling the harassment incidents," Walsh reported, holding up a thick folder. "We have documented evidence of inappropriate behavior toward 11 different female soldiers over a 7-month period. The pattern is unmistakable. Colonel Hutchinson systematically targeted women who had combat experience or leadership potential.
Nakamura reviewed the compiled evidence with growing confidence. Each incident by itself might have been dismissed as a misunderstanding or personality conflict, but taken together, they demonstrated a clear pattern of bias and harassment that would be difficult for prosecutors to ignore. More importantly, they established the context that had led to the confrontation with Lily, showing that her defensive response was the culmination of months of escalating abuse rather than an isolated incident of violence.
"What about the character witnesses?" he asked, turning to another stack of documents. "Overwhelming support," Walsh replied with obvious satisfaction. "We have statements from 37 soldiers who have served with Staff Sergeant Morrison, including 15 who were with her during combat deployments. Not one person has described her as violent or unstable. Several specifically mentioned that she was known for maintaining composure under extreme stress." The testimony painted a picture of a dedicated professional who had earned respect through competence and courage. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez had provided particularly compelling testimony about Lily's actions during a firefight in Kandahar, where she had maintained tactical discipline while under direct enemy fire. Lieutenant Chen had described her leadership during a complex engineering mission that had saved multiple lives. Even soldiers who had minimal contact with her spoke about her reputation for fairness and professionalism. While the defense was building its case, the prosecution was facing increasing difficulties in constructing a narrative that portrayed Lily as the aggressor. Major Kevin Sullivan, the prosecutor assigned to the case, had spent days reviewing the evidence and interviewing witnesses, but had found little support for Colonel Hutchinson's version of events. The medical evidence was particularly problematic for the prosecution's case. The emergency room physician who had treated Hutchinson's injury had noted that the fracture pattern was consistent with a defensive countermovement rather than an aggressive attack. The angle and force of the break suggested that Hutchinson had been reaching towards someone who had then deflected his arm, causing his own momentum to contribute to the injury. Dr. Sarah Kim, the base orthopedic surgeon who had performed the corrective surgery, had been even more specific in her report. The injury pattern indicates that Colonel Hutchinson's wrist was extended in a grasping motion when the fracture occurred. The defensive movement that caused the break was precisely the type of technique taught in military combatives training. If Staff Sergeant Morrison had intended to cause injury, the damage would have been more severe and in a different location. The technical analysis was devastating to Hutchinson's claims of unprovoked assault. If anything, the medical evidence suggested that Lily had shown remarkable restraint in her defensive response, using exactly the level of force necessary to break free from an unwanted grab without causing unnecessary additional harm. As the investigation continued, the media attention surrounding the case began to intensify. Military Times had published the first detailed account of the incident, followed by coverage in major newspapers and television networks. The story had captured public attention because it touched on multiple controversial issues: sexual harassment in the military, the integration of women into combat roles, abuse of authority by senior officers, and questions about when subordinates have the right to defend themselves against inappropriate conduct. Retired General Michael Crawford, a frequent military commentator, had appeared on several news programs to discuss the broader implications of the case. This incident highlights the ongoing challenges the military faces in creating truly inclusive command environments, he had told CNN. When senior officers allow personal bias to override professional judgment, they create situations that undermine unit cohesion and military effectiveness. The public scrutiny was adding pressure on all parties involved to reach a resolution that would restore confidence in the military justice system while addressing the underlying issues that had created the confrontation. Pentagon officials were reportedly concerned about the potential for congressional hearings if the case wasn't handled appropriately. Back at Fort Davidson, the soldiers of Alpha Battalion were struggling to maintain focus on their duties while dealing with the constant disruption of investigations and media attention. Many felt torn between loyalty to their chain of command and support for a fellow soldier who they believed had been wronged. The situation had created divisions within the unit that would take time and careful leadership to heal. Command Sergeant Major Fletcher had been working overtime to maintain morale and discipline, but even his respected leadership was being tested by the unprecedented circumstances. During a meeting with the company first sergeants, he had been frank about the challenges they faced. "This situation is going to get worse before it gets better," he had told them. "Our soldiers are watching how we handle this crisis, and their faith in military justice depends on seeing that the system works fairly for everyone, regardless of rank or gender. We need to stay focused on our mission while supporting both the investigation and our people." 6 weeks after the incident that shattered Colonel Hutchinson's wrist and his military career, the formal Article 32 hearing convened in a packed courtroom at Fort Stewart. The preliminary hearing would determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed with a court-martial against Staff Sergeant Lily Morrison, but everyone present understood that it had become much more than a simple legal proceeding. The case had evolved into a referendum on military culture, leadership accountability, and the rights of soldiers to defend themselves against abuse of authority. Lieutenant Colonel Janet Rivers presided over the hearing as the investigating officer, her reputation for fairness and thorough legal analysis making her an ideal choice for such a high-profile case. The courtroom was filled with military personnel, legal observers, and carefully selected media representatives, all watching as the most closely scrutinized military justice case in years finally reached its crucial phase. Captain Nakamura rose to present his opening statement, his confidence reflecting weeks of meticulous preparation and overwhelming evidence in Lily's favor. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Staff Sergeant Morrison was the victim of systematic harassment and abuse by Colonel Hutchinson, culminating in an inappropriate physical contact that triggered a defensive response consistent with her military training. This was not an assault. It was self-defense."
Against a commanding officer who had repeatedly violated his oath to lead with dignity and respect. The prosecution's opening was notably restrained, with Major Sullivan acknowledging the complexity of the case while maintaining that military discipline required consequences for any soldier who caused injury to a superior officer regardless of circumstances. His tone suggested that even he recognized the weakness of his position, but military prosecutors had little choice but to pursue charges when such a clear violation of hierarchy had occurred. The first witness was Command Sergeant Major Fletcher, whose testimony provided crucial context about military standards and the appropriateness of Hutchinson's conduct. Fletcher's 26 years of experience lent tremendous weight to his observations, and his detailed account of the inspection left no doubt about who had initiated the inappropriate behavior. "In my professional opinion," Fletcher testified, "Colonel Hutchinson's conduct during the inspection violated every principle of effective military leadership. His comments were personal attacks rather than professional criticism. His physical positioning was intimidating and inappropriate, and his attempt to physically restrain Staff Sergeant Morrison was completely unjustified given the circumstances." The cross-examination revealed the prosecution's desperation as they attempted to suggest that Fletcher's testimony was biased by personal loyalty to Lily. But Fletcher's reputation for integrity and his obvious reluctance to criticize a superior officer made such suggestions appear petty and ineffective. Lieutenant Chen followed with testimony about the broader pattern of harassment that had characterized Hutchinson's command. Her account of inappropriate comments during staff meetings, deliberate exclusion of female soldiers from opportunities, and the toxic atmosphere that had developed under his leadership painted a picture of systematic abuse that extended far beyond the specific incident with Lily. Colonel Hutchinson made it clear from his first week in command that he believed women had no place in combat units. He consistently undermined female soldiers, questioned their capabilities without cause, and created an environment where harassment was normalized and reporting it was discouraged. The medical testimony proved decisive in establishing the defensive nature of Lily's response. Dr. Sarah Kim took the stand to explain her analysis of the injury pattern, using anatomical models and photographs to demonstrate how the fracture had occurred.
The break in Colonel Hutchinson's wrist was caused by hyperextension during a grabbing motion that was suddenly redirected. This is entirely consistent with someone reaching for another person who then performed a defensive countermovement. If Staff Sergeant Morrison had intended to cause injury, the damage would have been more severe and in a completely different location. The prosecution's attempts to challenge the medical evidence fell flat when Dr. Kim calmly explained that her analysis was based on objective physical evidence rather than assumptions about intent or motivation. The injury pattern told a clear story that supported Lily's account of events rather than Hutchinson's claims of unprovoked assault. When Lily finally took the stand in her own defense, her composed demeanor and detailed recollection of events provided a stark contrast to the emotional accusations that had characterized Hutchinson's statements to investigators. She walked the court through months of escalating harassment, her attempts to address the situation through proper channels, and the split-second decision-making that had led to the physical confrontation. "When Colonel Hutchinson grabbed my shoulder, my training kicked in automatically," she testified. "I'd been conditioned to respond to aggressive physical contact as a potential threat, particularly in a situation where I'd already been subjected to verbal abuse and intimidation. My response was purely defensive. I was trying to break free from his grip, not cause him injury." The cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective, with Major Sullivan unable to shake her account or provoke the emotional response that might have undermined her credibility. Lily's military bearing remained impeccable throughout hours of questioning, reinforcing the character testimony that had portrayed her as a consummate professional who had never shown inappropriate aggression or loss of control. The surprise of the hearing came when several soldiers testified about incidents involving Colonel Hutchinson that hadn't been previously documented. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez described being cornered in a supply room where Hutchinson had made sexually suggestive comments about her combat gear. Corporal Lisa Thompson recounted being subjected to questions about her personal relationships that had no bearing on her military duties. Each testimony added another layer to the pattern of abuse that had characterized his command. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Captain Emily Foster, a military intelligence officer who had served briefly under Hutchinson's command before requesting a transfer. Her account of being deliberately excluded from planning meetings and having her professional judgment questioned in front of male subordinates demonstrated that the harassment extended beyond enlisted personnel to include female officers. Colonel Hutchinson created an environment where competent female soldiers were made to feel unwelcome and undermined, Foster testified. His behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was detrimental to military readiness and unit effectiveness. When Colonel Hutchinson finally took the stand, his testimony only served to reinforce the prosecution's weakening case. His defensive posture and attempts to justify his behavior as traditional military discipline rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. His claim that the physical contact had been appropriate as part of placing Lily under arrest was thoroughly demolished when Captain Nakamura pointed out that no grounds for arrest had existed at the time. "Colonel, isn't it true that your decision to place Staff Sergeant Morrison under arrest was motivated by anger at her refusal to be intimidated rather than any legitimate military infraction?" Hutchinson's stumbling response revealed the vindictive nature of his actions and undermined any remaining credibility his testimony might have carried. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers deliberated for only 2 hours before announcing her findings. The courtroom fell silent as she prepared to deliver a decision that would affect multiple careers and send a message about the military's commitment to addressing abuse of authority. "After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony," she began, "I find that insufficient evidence exists to support charges of assault against Staff Sergeant Morrison. The evidence clearly establishes that she was the victim of systematic harassment and that her actions during the incident in question were defensive in nature and proportionate to the threat she faced." The ruling was met with audible relief from Lily's supporters, but Rivers wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am recommending that Colonel Hutchinson face charges under Article 92 for dereliction of duty, Article 93 for maltreatment of subordinates, and Article 134 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. His behavior was not only inappropriate but dangerous to unit cohesion and military readiness. The ruling was met with audible relief from Lilly's supporters, but Rivers wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am recommending that Colonel Hutchinson face charges under Article 92 for dereliction of duty, Article 93 for maltreatment of subordinates, and Article 134 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. His behavior was not only inappropriate but dangerous to unit cohesion and military readiness. The complete vindication was more than Lilly had dared to hope for. Not only had she been cleared of all charges, but the military justice system had formally recognized her as the victim rather than the perpetrator. The recommendation for charges against Hutchinson sent a clear message that abuse of authority would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or seniority. 6 months later, Colonel Hutchinson accepted a plea agreement that resulted in his retirement at reduced rank and forfeiture of benefits. Lilly was promoted to Sergeant First Class and accepted a position as an instructor at the Army's Combat Engineering School, which she could help train the next generation of soldiers in both technical skills and professional conduct. The case became a turning point in military culture, leading to enhanced training for senior officers about appropriate conduct and strengthened protections for soldiers reporting harassment. Most importantly, it established a precedent that soldiers had both the right and responsibility to defend themselves against inappropriate conduct, even when it came from their superiors. The lesson was clear. True military discipline wasn't about blind obedience to authority, but about upholding the values and standards that made the military an institution worthy of respect and trust. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.